second session of our inquiry into the licensing of taxis and private hire vehicles. The first we heard from representatives of drivers and also licensing authorities. We'll be hosting two panels today. During our first panel, we'll be hearing from operators, and during our second panel, we'll be hearing from a range of witnesses from the voluntary and local government sectors. And before the witnesses introduce themselves, could I please ask you to be as brief as you can with your and concise as you can with your answers, as we've got quite a lot to get through today. So could I ask the witnesses to introduce themselves?
Good morning. My name is Kimberly Hurd. I'm Senior General Manager at Bolt for the UK and Ireland. We're live in over 20 cities, 50 councils, and have partnered with over 100,000 drivers across the UK. We've got a team of 200 in the UK.
Thank you. Emma O'Dwyer. I lead public policy for Uber here in the UK. Thank you for having us give evidence.
Hi, I'm Mark Robinson. I own Vokes Taxis Limited, co-owner. We've got 200 vehicles in Medway.
Morning, Andrew Wescott, Corporate and Government Affairs Director at Veezu. We're a private hire business licensed by over 60 authorities across England and Wales, and we partner with over 20,000 drivers nationally.
Excellent, welcome. So in our first evidence session, witnesses described the current licensing framework as broken. So from the operator perspective, how well is it working for you? I'll start with Kimberly.
So the fundamentals, we believe, of the licensing framework are upheld, but there are significant inefficiencies and room for modernization. So examples of where the national standards are being upheld is really on the safety side and on compliance. And so, for instance, 98% of documents are checked. Sorry, one second. I just want to make sure I'm checking my notes. 98% of boroughs that we're currently live in have requirements for record keeping. 87% have written complaints procedures, and 82% require processes to suspend drivers. However, there are areas to essentially modernize. So firstly, those aren't fully consistent. There are small inconsistencies across councils. Equally, there's a lack of digitization and also consistency in using digitally available tools, and also regional enforcement. We also, especially as a digital operator, are held under taxi provision, so we're meant to keep physical offices, even though we've got digital support 24/7 and the ability for drivers to essentially call, set meetings at any time. So there's room for improvement, but the core is being upheld practically.
Thank you. Emma, anything to add?
Thank you. I think we'd share the same sort of feedback as Kimberly gave. In general, we think that the sector is really well regulated and that licensing authorities uphold high standards, particularly in safety. But we think there's some room for improvement. I think, as the committee will be aware, there's kind of quite loose stipulations in terms of requirements in primary legislation, which is underpinned by statutory standards. However, we think these could go further and that there should be clearer national mandatory standards that set a clear baseline in licensing, and we set out a few areas where we think that could be helpful.
Thank you. Mark?
I think the answer, I'd answer that by, if I talk about the area in which we operate, there's good oversight, there is very good licensing control over the vehicles that are licensed in the area, but it doesn't work when there are vehicles that are licensed elsewhere that are operating. There is zero enforcement. Yeah, so I think for us it works. Apart from that.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
I think the frameworks are in place for regulating the market, and particularly from a safety point of view. I think it's then the implementation and where we see sort of variations in conditions and policies across the 263 licensing authorities in England and Wales. So things like the amount of time it takes for a driver, a vehicle, an operator to get their license application through, significant variations in those. The costs of licensing vary widely, and then things like whether vehicles require signage, whether that's operator delivery or not, and then the really important things like training for drivers, whether it's sort of safeguarding, disability awareness. There are just significant variations there that mean that there's a real lack of standardisation across the sector.
Thank you. Kimberly, your evidence was more positive than other witnesses on whether whether local authorities are able to regulate the sector effectively, and although in your statistics that you've just read out, the majority of authorities seem to be complying, but there were a significant 10-20% of authorities that weren't, depending on the different factor. So why do you have, given that, why do you have a more positive view than other operators?
That's a good question, and I think there's a difference between advocating for consistent national safety regulation and codes. We believe that passengers across the nation should have the same level of service and safety. And so whether or not the core of the framework currently upholds in a practical way, we do believe that needs to be further clarified and made mandatory. But we also believe that there's room for, on a local basis, for authorities to continue to issue licenses and flex non-safety related restrictions, specifically for their local jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you. I'll now go on to Baggy.
Thanks, Chair. So just concentrating on licensing standards for a moment. 263 or 270 odd officers, 230 different sets of licensing conditions across England, and this has been described to us as a mess. What impact does that level of variation have on you as operators? Start, Andrew.
Yeah, happy to go. Yeah, so as I said, we're licensed by 60 different authorities, and there are variations. I think as an operator, our view is that we would look to take the highest standard wherever it is. And as an example, I'll give you one where drivers have to present, before they on board with Veezu, they have to present certain documentation to show us that they're compliant, whether it's their private hire badge, their DVLA licence, their vehicle insurance, MOT. There are variations across licensing authorities. Some require us to see an MOT, some don't. Some require 6 monthly MOT, some it's a year. We as an operator, just to make it so that we're hitting the highest standard and really simplifying and standardising it for us as a business, we just hit that highest standard across the business there. So I guess we try and take the complexity and the variation out of it in the way that we operate.
As an operator, we're in one licensed area, so I'm very different to the guys on the panel here. We have experience of the Medway Licensing Authority, and the licensing is, as far as we're concerned, it's very good. It's a very high standard. Perhaps, we would argue that the standard is in some areas too high. But we are held to a very high standard by the authority, and we work very closely with it. So from my point of view, that works. It's when you move out of the area, and again, I'll come back to the enforcement point, but we're going to discuss that later.
Thank you. We operate in more than 100 different licensing authorities, and we have licenses in each of those. And there is a significant amount of variation, although I'd say variation within a mean. We've developed, compliance is very important to us, so we have a regulatory operations team who executes on all of our different obligations across our different licensing authorities, and they do that well. I think our view is, yes, there's a bit of complexity for operators, but the main message I think I'd want to impart is that there's some opportunity to improve standards from a safety perspective, and that's probably the most important thing I'd focus on when talking about why we should have clearer standards in licensing mandated.
I can only echo the points that the other panelists have said. We actually, as a team, counted. So across the 50 jurisdictions we're currently live, or councils we're currently live, we have 3,900 individual requirements. Bolt is live in 50 countries, 600 cities, and this is the most complex of all of them. So in order to effectively meet them, which we do, we actually have paired across each council a dedicated contact. We have over 100 people specifically focused on compliance and safety in the UK for that reason. So there is room, again, for consistency, and just like the other panelists have said, everybody within a mean is working towards the same objective of safety across the board.
And then just briefly then, hearing what you're saying, does where you license and the variation affect your decision making on where you'd go and which area you would go to to licence your operations.
Sorry, you're asking me. I'm not sure I understand the question. So we're a national. We operate nationally, and so it's we don't make a choice on which license in order to or where to be licensed and to operate based on requirements. We go based on both passenger and rider and driver need, and so we're currently live again across 20 cities for that reason. I've personally joined Bolt to expand that further.
Okay. Andrew, you're an operator that operates in different areas.
Yeah. I mean, we're licensed in every area where we operate, so that's the basic decision, if you like. We don't go into an area if we don't hold it, or we'd hold an operator license in the area where we operate.
You don't avoid any particular areas or prefer any areas?
That's interesting. Thank you. Okay, Jacob.
Thank you. Is it time for the government to have one set of national licensing standards that apply everywhere? Do you want to start with Emma?
Thank you. Yes, so we think there should be national minimum standards. So that is both clarity in what the requirements are up front and that they should be set as a baseline that applies everywhere. In our evidence, we set out a few areas where we think that could be very usefully deployed. Background checks was one area we thought could be helpfully clarified. Safety reporting, so how we share complaints or history around trips with our licensing authorities. CCTV, we think there's a lot of opportunity to improve safety outcomes by increasing the uptake of CCTV. Clarity in the rules there would be very helpful. We think enforcement against these national minimum standards should apply. Any licensing authority should be able to apply to enforce them with drivers in their area. And the last one, which is important to us, is a licensing database that's accessible for operators. It's critically important to safety that we know if a driver has had their licence revoked or suspended. We want to make sure that they're not continuing to work on our service in a timely fashion. We think a national database we could consult multiple times a day, which we have with some licensing authorities, would be really good for that. However, in some areas, how we get that information is still slightly ad hoc, and we think that's a safety risk. So those are the areas we'd call out as being important to clarify, yes, with some national minimum standards.
Really?
I guess only to echo that, we do believe that there's room to have improved and consistent safeguarding and vetting, digital first compliance, use of the existing NR3 and improving the NR3 database, both on consistency of usage and also on adding things like daily flags and checks. And then lastly, making sure that cross-border enforcement and joint enforcement has either better powers or is more empowered across the industry.
Mark?
I think we'd agree that national standards make sense to set a baseline with the potential to have local variation that sits on the top, taking into account the differences across the regions. Enforcement is the big issue as far as we're concerned. We support standardisation. We do feel that that the whole enforcement issue is the big play. So it's all very well the local authorities having the power to enforce, but in many cases they're just not going to have the resources to be able to enforce. And that I think is the big issue that we would see originating with national standards.
Have you got any thoughts on what the government could do around enforcement? Because we have heard that from other pieces of evidence that it would be difficult.
Yeah, well, my approach is probably different to the others on the panel again. I believe that local licensing and cross-border hiring is a significant issue. If cross-border hiring was taken away from the equation, then you have local authorities enforcing over vehicles and drivers that are licensed in their authority. It's worked for many years, and it's only the kind of the advancement of technology and organisations looking to take advantage of the opportunities that are presented by the advancement in technology that's having the system or leading the system to break down as it is at the moment. Local licensing with local enforcement, it just makes sense to us.
Andrew?
Yeah, supportive of national standards, and I think it will bring, it needs to bring consistency to some of those areas I point out, around, time frames around licensing, costs of licensing, and then the levels of training that are required. I think using the term minimum is slightly challenging, and I think particularly when we're talking about safety and public perception. I'm not suggesting that Emma was inferring this by using that term, but there's a slight risk that it gives the perception of a lower base, and then I don't think it then doesn't necessarily resolve some of the challenges, because if other licenses already go above those standards, we'll still have the inconsistencies that you could argue exist right now. I think just on the point of enforcement, I think national standards have to be coupled with enforcement that crosses borders.
We'll come on to
Okay, sorry.
It's been suggested that licensing authorities might choose to exceed national standards. I think you talk about a minimum base and then some might exceed it. Do you think this would still encourage cross-border hiring? And how do you think a national standard would have to, what would it entail to avoid that happening?
I think with cross-border hiring, it's important to understand why drivers choose to license in other areas, and I think one of those drivers is, or one of the reasons they do that motivations is to do with the cost and the time frames involved in licensing. So just to give you some examples, Wolverhampton Council, which is obviously the oft-quoted one, is £138 for a driver to licence for 3 years. In Portsmouth, not picking on Portsmouth necessarily for any other reason than we're licensed there, it costs £336 for the same time frame. So you can understand why a driver may choose to go and licence.
We'll come on to that wider issue shortly, and we had similar evidence at our last session. Scott, you wanted to pick up a particular question.
Yeah, very quickly, Emma, the point you made about a national driver database was quite interesting. You're saying that a driver in one area in your system could be blocked but then could appear elsewhere, and you wanted clarity on that. But apologies, you must undertake some sort of background checks on your drivers. You must know the national insurance number. So does that not allow you to just stop them right across your system if you know the national insurance number?
Yeah, so to be clear, what I meant by that was, so yes, if we're informed that a driver should no longer be appearing because they've had their licence revoked or suspended, then they cannot operate anywhere on Uber. That's absolutely clear.
Okay.
Our point is that at the moment there's some variation in how we receive that information from licensing authorities. Some are great, and they have very technology-first systems where databases that we can prompt multiple times a day and ensure that we have an up-to-date list. In other places that can be much more ad hoc. It can be email, and there's no sort of timeline or SLA standard by which we would know that information. And so we think it would be good to build on what's there already, which is the NR3 system database, which licensing authorities share between each other, to allow operators like us to also see that, but also for it to be real-time and mutually accessible.
Okay, so that's a really good point, because these could be quite serious allegations against a driver, and you're saying it could be
and we're going to come on to NR3S shortly, but we'll go back to cross-border hiring. Elsie.
Thanks, Chair. Morning all. I'd like to come to each member of the panel on this, but I'll go to Emma first as the representative of Uber, if that's okay. In its written evidence, Uber described cross-border hiring as an essential freedom that supports connectivity and benefits drivers, consumers and local economies. Others have told us it's a significant problem. Who's correct?
So we believe that the travelling public wouldn't expect that they would be limited to not travel across licensing authority boundaries. The reality of having controls like that would mean that lots of trips that happen today and that people do just wouldn't take place. Quite regularly, locations of important civic importance to people, be it the shopping centre, the university, the hospital, are outside of their licensing boundaries, and indeed people don't generally know where they are. We think that the concern to be addressed about variation in standards is to ensure that there are national minimum standards, and that gives passengers the confidence that a driver who's licensed in Luton is the same as safe as a driver licensed anywhere else, and that's the right public policy solution to that concern.
Kimberly, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, cross-border is essentially the way people live and work. So let's just take London as an example, where we are here today. I crossed several boroughs to get here this morning. There are 32 boroughs in London, and there's one consistent standard across and one license across. Equally, if we think about other large areas, and especially outside of London, the density of councils and boroughs is actually quite close, meaning people are crossing all of the time. But if I could use one specific example, because we often talk, or I hear Wolverhampton and, for instance, Manchester mentioned, in our records, 47% of our drivers based in Manchester have Wolverhampton licenses. And, I believe, as Veezu had said, often the reason why drivers end up selecting an out-of-council license is because of speed, because they want to work faster, and cost. Outside of that, the differences between Manchester and Wolverhampton and how they issue licenses for drivers is minimal, especially on the safety side. The only difference is a local knowledge test. And actually, I would argue, especially myself, as I use SatNav every day, that local knowledge might not be essential. It's also an additional cost. Mm-hmm. So for those reasons, drivers tend to live and work in one area rather than sort of commuting in and going back home. They live and work in one area. They happen to be licensed somewhere else. And it's the same with passengers. So passengers expect, and especially as Emma just highlighted, if they're going to a place of interest or if they're going to work, often, especially in metro areas, they don't live and work in the same city area. So it's just a natural way of life and work, to be honest.
So my borough, my constituency that I represent is Hurd and Middleton North, which is in Rochdale Borough in Greater Manchester. So there's 40% of PHVs that are and taxis that are licensed out of area. I was speaking to the head of public protection at Rochdale Borough Council, and he says that he is concerned about the number of taxis and PHVs that are licensed out of area, and part of that's around data sharing. It'd just be interesting. So, just to kind of ask really, are you satisfied that you're meeting the standards of local authorities like mine when it comes to passenger safety?
So on that point, and I think this comes for anybody who works across every council. So Bolt in particular, we do work directly with every council to meet the local requirements, and we often exceed them. As a digital platform, what we're able to do is make sure from driver onboarding, driver vetting, ways that we're checking through selfie verification, also from a passenger safety perspective, we go above industry standards. We also resolve 75% of inbound issues and complaints within 6 to 8 hours. So we really go above and beyond essentially what we're supposed to be doing, or what the minimum thresholds are. The additional point is we also build in safety features. So again, something that's very important both to us and we believe the industry is making sure both passengers and drivers feel safe. And so for that reason, we have live journey tracking. We've got an emergency SOS button. We've got additional privacy details and codes to make sure that both passengers and drivers feel safe and comfortable.
Mark and Andrew, I don't know if you've got any comments on the issue of cross-border operating.
I disagree with a lot of what's been said. Again, I'm talking from the area in which we operate, which is the Medway towns. 95% plus of our journeys, probably 97, 98% of our journeys they originate within the Medway towns, or they end in the Medway towns, and we all know the ABBA kind of rules on that. We see a situation where we're not just talking about cross-border hiring. We see many vehicles that are not licensed in Medway come in and operate in Medway, and they operate without any oversight whatsoever. So from a safety concern, whether it's to do with the quality of the vehicles, the condition of the vehicles, or the driver, there is zero oversight because the local authority does not have the any ability or authority to even inspect those vehicles, the majority of which are licensed by TfL. So I see this slightly differently in that we're not just talking about journeys which cross borders. We're talking about drivers that absolutely deliberately work in a very different area from which they were licensed, and they can do so without any oversight.
And Andrew?
Yeah, I think availability and supply of private hire services are synonymous with safety, and there are areas where we operate where private hire is the only 24/7 safe, reliable mode of transport. There's simply very little or no public transport available. So if someone needs to take a late night journey, they're relying on private hire. In many areas, there aren't enough licensed drivers to satisfy all of those bookings, or they might not be around at those times. So having the ability to, have a flexible operation, and for, drivers that perhaps not, aren't licensed in that area to be able to operate, it is essential, and it has that link to safety. And I think just thinking about, our hometown in Cardiff, lots of events go on there. During very, very busy periods, drivers will come in from Newport, from Bridgend, from surrounding areas to help with the demand at that point. Otherwise, passengers would be left without, would either be left waiting for a long time, or they wouldn't have a service at all.
Scott, did you want to pick up something from the Edinburgh perspective?
No, I find this interesting, because in Edinburgh we don't have cross-border hiring, and everybody seems quite happy, to be honest. We have drivers who often live quite far outside Edinburgh, but they're licensed to operate in Edinburgh. I think drivers from outside Edinburgh can bring rides in, but we don't have people licensed in surrounding local authorities coming into the city to operate day in, day out in a way that wouldn't be great for the city, because enforcement is so much harder. So why is it working in Edinburgh, but yet it seems impossible in England?
Well, I mean, the problem is it's not. It's like, yes, I see what you're trying to get at. So the ABBA principle, to Kimberly and Emma, is which used to be the way of operating, I think, up until the regulatory changes in, was it 2015, I think? Would the world fall apart if we went back to that principle of ABBA?
I mean, the world certainly wouldn't fall apart, but I think what we would see, and what we do see in the average day of a driver, is that they actually cross multiple boundaries, and multiple boundaries can be within quite a small geographical area. In general, if you're restricting the kind of reliability of demand for drivers around the edge of their operating area, so yes, they might be able to get a trip there, but if they go over there, will they be able to get a trip back? Means that what they tend to do is gravitate more to the centre of the licensing area within which they're licensed, and we do see that in Scotland. And it has an impact on people who live further out from the immediate sort of centre of a city, if you like. They have fewer drivers will go there because they will have less reliability of demand and therefore less work, and therefore that means people who want to get trips from there, can have fewer opportunities to do so, and it has effects on pulling services into the centre of town, which might cause congestion or other secondary issues. So we do see that it does cause us some challenges in Scotland.
Okay.
But I don't hear friends and colleagues telling me they find it difficult to get taxis anywhere.
But I think Emma specifically mentioned suburban and out of Edinburgh towns.
I live in suburbia.
Okay.
I'm proud to do so.
In the city of Edinburgh.
Yeah.
I think the point that Emma and Andrew were making was about local authorities further away from the city, but it's an important point. Lawrence, did you want to come in at this point?
I think Elsie, did you want to come in first?
One more quickly.
Sorry, Elsie. Yes, sorry.
Thank you very much. This one's just for Kimberly, if that's okay, as the representative of Bolt. If, as Bolt states in its written evidence, and you've just repeated again now, cross-border hiring doesn't lead to worse safety outcomes, why do you think we've heard so much about its effect on passenger safety?
I think the challenge is probably consistency. And one, from our perspective, what we want to do is give the data and the support, to local councils to be able to enforce locally.
You are committed to sharing that data?
And we do actively. So not only do we meet the minimum thresholds and standards within each of the councils, but we also have a law enforcement portal. So any council at any given time can request information from us. We also have a dedicated, I think I mentioned before, each council has a dedicated representative on our team, and we have a team of 100 people who are responding very quickly to any inbound inquiries. But there's also, I think, a lack of joint enforcement. So we've actually asked the councils that we worked with how many have done joint enforcement efforts, and there are only 3 of the 50 that we currently work with. And so I think there's a lot more to be done around joint enforcement, and I think that is something that, again, as we're now reviewing some of the regulations around safety, I think that's something that can be improved.
Okay, thank you. Lawrence, and then I'll go to Steph.
Thank you. It's following up on Elsa's point about safety, and this question isn't so much about your individual actions as operators as it is about the suitability of the current system. And the 2018 Tusk and Finish group did recommend that the 2015 cross-border hiring changes be reversed on the basis partly of public safety. TfL at the time quoted Rotherham's licensing manager as saying there are numerous examples in Rotherham of drivers being refused a licence or having their licence revoked, only to then make use of that 2015 subcontracting provision. He said the sole aim of these drivers is to circumvent the high standards that have been introduced in Rotherham, and we feel that this will put the public at significant risk of harm. Do you recognise that description?
I would say no. Uber has never relied on the 2015 Deregulation Act. We don't subcontract. Everywhere we license, we maintain the triple lock. So that wouldn't be how we would see what's going on. What we would say is this is why we think it's really important around revocations and refusals that information is shared with councils. And we think the NR3S, which I think has come about since that review, is a really important tool that should be built on now to make that more accessible.
Do you observe that behaviour from other players in the industry?
As in they maintain the same standards as us?
No, I'm talking about poor practice.
Not really going to comment, I think, on other players. I think in general, private hire is a very safe service, and that high standards are maintained both by operators and licensing authorities.
I think if the NR3S system is used properly, then a driver that's refused, revoked or suspended anywhere should not be able to achieve a licence anywhere else. So I think firstly that system needs to be looked at properly, but I share the view that there's an inconsistency in the information that's shared with operators in terms of directly from licensing authorities as to whether a driver has been revoked or refused or suspended. Not all of them even suspend, sometimes they go straight to there's a real inconsistency there. Some provide us with a daily list of drivers that we can then act on, and some, even when we've reported to them an incident, we never actually find out the outcome of that. So that's a significant issue that needs to be addressed through national standards.
I think following on from the 2015 changes, it reinforces our belief that local authorities should have enforcement over drivers that are licensed in those authorities. That system worked. It worked for many years, and it has been, I don't want to say deliberately broken, but the changes in 2015 have contributed to a reduction in safety because of the lack of local enforcement.
We have a slightly different view to that. So to your question about, just to give color to how digital operators or PHVs operate currently, in London, a driver is checked at Bolt 100 times a year automatically, and we have manual checks as well included in our process. That's because through TfL we're integrated with them, and so we're able to do consistent checks all throughout the year. We as much as we agree, and I think the chairman's point is that we believe that local licensing should stay locally. We also, though, believe it's not about cross-border. So just as an example, and I'm just going to quote a stat, only 3% of safety complaints in London came from out of borough drivers, and it has a significantly lower complaint rate per 10,000 rides. It's about 83 times lower, so that's 0.128 versus 4.894 to be specific. So it's not an issue. Safety is not an issue of cross-border. It's around the consistency and the digital tools that are in place for local authorities to be able to stay on top of these changes.
Okay. Thank you. We touched on NR3S, so can I go to Steph now?
Yeah, shouldn't operators just have access to it? And what would the downsides be? Obviously, thinking about drivers' rights in particular, we don't want to get to a situation of the last decade with construction industry blacklisting. So should they, and what would the downsides be? Maybe start with Andrew.
I mean, having access to an NR3S is one thing. I think making sure it's being used effectively by all licensing authorities is the first point I'd make. And then as I'm sort of slightly repeating myself in my previous answer, but making sure that licensing authorities are sharing, the result, or if they've had a complaint directly to them about a driver, making sure that we're aware of that. If they've chosen to suspend or revoke a driver, that we're made aware of that as well. I think that's the key thing. Whether NR3S is the system for using for that, ultimately it's just making sure that communication is effective and timely.
We don't have any issue with this whole subject. We work very closely with the local licensing authority. It's a daily dialogue. So when any issue comes up, whether it's purely a complaint or whether there's a driver in the area that shouldn't be because they've been barred elsewhere, it's a daily dialogue, and that localism, I think, that adds an extra layer of safety.
I'm interested, is that just because you and the local authority have got sort of closer access to the communities you're serving, and you've got relationships with people who means that when something looks or sounds iffy, or is it just a function of that relationship and data sharing provisions that you've got in place?
I think it's the former. We're not in a small area. Medway Towns has got close on 300,000 people, so it's a fairly large licensed area. But when there is a very good relationship with the local licensing authority, so it's very easy to pick up the phone if there's something going wrong and deal with it there and then. That happens all the time.
We would agree. We think, to Andrew's point, whether it's the NR3S or sort of another version of that's a database that we can access, the key point, which Andrew also made, is that it's updated in a timely fashion, and we have sort of security around that.
Operators only, I can speak actually only for Bolt, we only onboard drivers who've received their license locally. And so the focus of this should be around how to improve both access and consistency to NR3 for councils, and improve some of the features available, including things like daily flags. We need more confidence that that's being upheld to a standard and is either mandatory or very clear and consistent across councils.
Because there's a danger that the statistics you quoted earlier might not be fully representative of the reality if data isn't flowing between the operators and the licensing authorities in the same way that you've described it flowing in London.
Yes, but it's a bit of almost a secondary priority that operators have access. I think the first issue is that it's consistently used, and the data is correct, and that local authorities are currently using it.
Do you think it is consistently used at the moment?
I don't think we'd have visibility, really.
I don't have evidence.
You can see the whole country, but you can't see whether you feel as though, just on balance, the system is being consistently used by different licenses.
I can say anecdotally it isn't, but I don't have the evidence or the data to be able to support that.
Okay.
Yeah, what I mean specifically is we wouldn't have visibility into who is using the NR3S, because that's only accessible to local.
You can't see it. Yeah. Right, understood. Thank you.
Did you have anything to add?
With NR3S, I agree, we don't have access, but what I can say is, and you might make the point that we have very good relationships with all our licensing authorities. It's about the rules that they have in place around data sharing effectively that seems to prohibit. So, like I said, there are licensing authorities that will share a daily list, and some, when we ask about the information, they will say we can't share that with you based on GDPR rules. Yeah. So there's that's legal advice that they're being given. So that's outside of how effective the relationship is. That's just a decision that they've made as a licensing authority.
But isn't there a bigger point to this? The local licensing authority, they, because there are many out-of-town licensed drivers, they have no idea of the drivers that are regularly working supposedly in their territory, but over which they have absolutely no oversight whatsoever.
They wouldn't be checking just because someone drove across a county border.
Exactly that, and it's the part of the big problem here are drivers that are licensed in whether it's Wolverhampton or elsewhere, but they are consistently working in whether it's Manchester or Medway or wherever else. It's they go shopping for their license in the easiest place to get it, and then they who knows where they're working outside of the operator that in many cases is a national operator.
If I may, just if there were to be greater access to NR3S, the big list of banned and suspended licences for operators, what would the downside potentially be?
Okay. Right. Okay.
Good thing.
It's not that there's a downside. I think we're all. I can't speak for the panel, but the fact that we were silent there, I think means that we're all very much in favor and finding the right ways to make sure that there's consistent data sharing across councils and operators. Again, I do think, though, the challenge is, one, ensuring that consistency in access and usage at a local level. And I think to the point on cross-border, both hiring and enforcement is making sure that there's clear both empowerment and rules and how that's done. The fact that 3 out of the 50 councils that we currently work in have done that means that there isn't enough attention or focus on being able to do that effectively.
You don't fear a construction industry blacklist type situation where drivers find themselves unable to work anywhere suddenly because of a complaint that they've had very limited rights to respond to, for instance?
We've not had experience of that.
We might come on to that issue for drivers' perspective. Alex, you want to come in briefly and then I'll go to Elsie?
Yes, thank you. I was just wondering about the complaints that come in. Presumably some complaints come in via the app because a passenger thinks that that's the easiest and simplest way for them. And some complaints you'll be told about from licensing authorities. Are they very different in the kind of, type of complaints you're getting from those two different angles, or are they broadly similar?
Yeah. So I guess probably we would get many more through the app. As you know, if you're an Uber user, we prompt people to give feedback, and that reveals to us a lot of information that may be kind of safety relevant. And we will look at all kinds of things that could possibly have any kind of safety concern attached to them. So the greater number will come through that fashion. Fewer people will get in touch with their licensing authorities to make a complaint and pass that on, and they will tend to be in more serious but rarer instances.
Yeah, I would say for us, we have obviously app feedback, but we also take significant number of bookings over the phone as well. So we would have that as another route to take complaints. And I think, in terms of the licensing authority, it is often the more serious ones where the passenger may go directly. But if they do come to us first, we will take that to the licensing authority as well, which is a requirement as part of the conditions.
As far as we're concerned, when there is a complaint that said in the Medway towns, someone gets into one of our vehicles, they may make a complaint to us, or if they think it's serious enough, they may make a complaint to the local licensing authority. One of the problems that they will experience is if they get in a car that's not locally licensed, they haven't got a clue who to make that complaint to. So it will naturally, if it's an Uber vehicle, they'll naturally make the complaint to Uber, and Uber deal with it in the way that they deal with it. But that, I know from experience that it's, I probably shouldn't say this, but it's when we get a complaint directly, it's dealt with. But we alarm bells start ringing if we get contacted by the local licensing authority to say there's a complaint against us. You naturally take it much more seriously. It's better publicised. So asking the operators to kind of manage their complaint system, I don't think that is as strong as having a dedicated authority, that the licensing authority that the complaint is made directly to.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Elsie?
Thanks, Chair. If, as some of you suggest, that abolishing cross-border hiring is neither practical nor desirable, what realistic steps do you think could be taken to help both licensing authorities and operators ensure that local standards are enforceable? Andrew, I'll go to you with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think national standards definitely would help that, and that's, like I said, across the board, whether it's training, whether it's making sure that the standardisation around licensing, timeframes and costs. But I think the enforcement point is important here. There has to be enforcement powers across jurisdictions as well. And Kimberly's touched on it. There are examples of joint enforcement already in place, and so that there is a precedent for that. And I think that's something that should be explored more, because if it's already happening, why isn't it happening more frequently?
Would the other members of the panel agree with that? I know, Kimberly, that you've touched on it, which is why I'm not going to go to you, but I'll go to Emma if that's okay.
Yeah, we would strongly agree with that. There should be national minimum standards, and everybody should be able to enforce those national minimum standards in their area.
Okay. Mark, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that cross-border hiring should be, should be outside the legal framework.
Just quickly, Kimberly, you suggested that better use of joint enforcement, actually Andrew suggested the same, powers could resolve concerns about cross-border hiring. When licensing authorities operate under different standards and have very different levels of income and capacity, I'd just like a few more details about how you think joint enforcement could work in practice.
I think it's a very fair point. I mean, just Wolverhampton, as an example, has 100 people dedicated to licensing and to the specific function, where many have one or a fractional person who's dedicated. So there is an issue of resourcing, I think, across local from a local perspective. There's also an issue of training and costs associated as well. So I think that there's, again, sort of a question of, as we're reviewing these standards, how do we help local authorities better be able to access the powers that they already have and become aware of the powers that they already have so that it can be more jointly enforced?
Because I was just thinking, if we have minimums, if we have a more or less consistent standards, therefore the difference in authorities could be price. So there'd still be a risk that people would shop around, drivers would shop around, and Wolverhampton reckon their sheer volume gives them economies of scale and thus the price benefit. So is there still that risk that we'd have we'd still have that cross-border licensing?
I would argue that if we're having national standards, they need to cover everything, and that would include the cost and the time frames involved in granting licences.
Yeah. Okay, Baggy, do you want to come in?
Just clarity on joint enforcement. Some authorities, when they talk about joint enforcement, insist there's got to be two people there, one from the licensing authority and one from where they're operating. But if the standards were the same, wouldn't it be better to have any person being able to do the enforcement because they would enforce the right standards?
We support that. Yeah. So any officer in any licensing authority could enforce effectively the
standards.
The standard. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. We'll now go to Lawrence.
Thank you. One of the issues that we're particularly interested about in this inquiry is disability access. And we've heard evidence from Transport for All that disabled passengers often face discrimination and refusals or cancellations of bookings. Similarly, guide dogs report that 63% of guide dog handlers refused service in the past year. And Leonard Cheshire's told us that local authorities often fail to respond to complaints about disability discrimination. Is there a systemic issue here? Is there something in the way that licensing works that is failing disabled passengers?
I think the first point to make is, if we are made aware of either a disabled passenger, a passenger that require, and when I say disabled, the majority of disabilities are not visible, so that's an important point to make. A wheelchair accessible user or a blind passenger with an assistant dog, if we're made aware of that, we immediately report it to the licensing authority, and we would deactivate that driver so they wouldn't be able to take any further bookings until a full investigation has taken place. I think the issue here is a significant challenge across the entire sector, and I don't think it's for one stakeholder within the sector to solve. I think the lack of training, only 2/3, and Transport for All's evidence and the LGA's evidence set out that only 2/3 of licensing authorities provide any kind of disability awareness training, and then there are significant inconsistencies within that training, so that has to be addressed. That type of training should be mandatory in our view. I think then the other point is the incentive for driver partners to purchase wheelchair accessible vehicles. Those vehicles are significantly more expensive. There are much fewer models and makes of those vehicles, and we're already seeing potentially that the VAT exemption on those type of vehicles is going to be removed, which I think will further exacerbate this problem. So I think there is a challenge that all of us have to take responsibility for in this, and I think that we would work with licensing authorities, we would work with national government to resolve this.
I think that, this is maybe something to do with the fact that local companies are not purely digital. So, and I don't know what the situation is with all of my colleagues on the panel. But where we have somebody with a specific requirement, generally we have a conversation with them. We take phone calls. Most of our bookings are via phone calls, so we're able to understand the requirements, and we're able then to deal with that properly. But I would echo what Andrew said in terms of the cost of vehicles is prohibitive. By trying to enforce all vehicles to be wheelchair accessible or anything else, which is one of the ways the local authority is trying to deal with it, is very difficult, because there just isn't there isn't the funding available, and there isn't the return available for the sort of expense that the drivers would have to go to.
I think I share the views of the other panel members. There's quite a few different issues kind of going on there. We think better training would be helpful. Incentives, again, around vehicles is also extremely helpful. We take all such complaints in relation to service denial extremely seriously, and we make sure that we act on those, but we think better training would be helpful. We also have special products that are designed specifically to help disabled people access our services. So we have an assist service with drivers as specially trained to help people who might need extra help getting in or out of a vehicle, and indeed with wheelchair accessible vehicles as well.
Very similar. So one from a systemic point, the lack of both training and also funding support, and a lack of available models, especially from an EV perspective, that are wheelchair accessible, means that less than 2% of vehicles in the UK for PHV are currently accessible. Bolt, we've launched Bolt Assist. We've got a WAV category as well. And even though we literally take no money and we offer incentives, it's very difficult to actually onboard and to find additional drivers to fulfill the demand that we have on platform for that reason. It's not a licensing issue. It's actually a systemic industry issue for the lack of incentives, the lack of training, for drivers essentially to upgrade their vehicles or to get another vehicle that would meet those requirements. To your point around, in particular, sort of guide dogs or support, from our perspective, we've had 34 complaints or 34 reports of a driver refusing a guide dog in the last 12 months. We take those very seriously. I think of it like Emma and Uber just said. So we investigate all complaints for passenger refusals, and we also, in those instances, also report those to the councils. And after 2 complaints from a passenger and speaking with the driver, we review termination on our platform. So we take that very seriously as well.
Okay, thank you. Scott?
So Kimberly, I'm picking on you, but I think others have made the same point. I mean, you talked about the lack of incentives and training for drivers to have accessible vehicles, but you could provide those incentives and training if you wanted to.
We do.
As a company, you could.
Mm-hmm. So we do provide the incentives we can. So one, Bolt doesn't take any commission. We take no money from Bolt Assist. We essentially connect the drivers and the passengers directly. We've also offered incentives for onboarding and signing up. But again, the costs are quite prohibitive, and even the designs and the types of vehicles that are available are prohibitive.
But yet, black cab companies are able to operate at a profit, in most parts, I understand, with accessible vehicles, but for some reason you're saying your business model's not compatible with that. Are you not really just hammering down prices and disabled people are paying the price for that? I'm looking at you, but I think it applies to other operators here. This is about keeping prices low, and disabled people are paying the price for that.
So again, in this instance, we're not taking literally any money from connecting a passenger, a disabled passenger, or to be fair with Bolt Assist, it's also available for older people who need more assistance. So we're not driving down the prices. What we're trying to do is provide a service.
You could choose to have more accessible vehicles in your fleet, and that would come at a cost to all riders. That's just the way it works. So I'm picking on you, which is unfair.
No, it's okay.
So Emma, if I was to call an Uber, how likely is it to be an accessible wheelchair accessible vehicle?
So, I'm actually not sure of the precise numbers. I could take that away. And
is it more than 5% likely, more than 50% likely, more than 1% likely?
I mean, what's really important for Uber?
Is it not shameful you don't know?
I have to take that number away, and we'll look to get it to you. But
is it not incredible that you don't know? Is that not quite an important?
No.
But your values as a company, you don't know how much of your fleet is accessible to wheelchair users.
The reality is that will vary quite a lot across the country, and the reason for that will be, as other panel members have touched on, is that the vehicle requirements locally will be quite significantly different. So in some parts of the country, such as Brighton, there's...
Again, this is about you meeting minimum requirements rather than showing leadership and have more accessible vehicles in your fleet.
The availability in terms of driver supply and vehicle supply locally, and how many vehicles have been licensed, and that's why we touched on incentives to ensure that there are more of those. You mentioned black cabs. The numbers of black cabs are in decline, and one of the reasons for that is the vehicles are extremely expensive.
It's because you're undercutting them with a cheaper fleet. That's what's happening.
And also black cabs in London, I know, are required to be fully wheelchair accessible, but but we know the numbers are declining, and you're saying that's because of the cost of the vehicles, and their fares are much higher.
Yeah, that's one of the contributing factors.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Anything to add, Mark, Andrew? No. Okay. Right. Okay. Alex, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. So we've heard from some local taxi firms who feel that they face unfair competition from the larger app-based private hire platforms. To start with, I wonder, from our larger app-based companies here, who do you feel that you are competing with? Are you competing with each other? Are you competing with, ABC taxis of somewhere or other? Or are you competing with these the taxis on the taxi rank outside the stations?
I guess I'll go first.
The answer can't be all of them. If you think it's all of them, try and rank it a bit.
Unfortunately, it is all. We really support both passenger and driver choice. And what we hear from drivers in particular is they often work across multiple, both platforms, to your point, the app-based, as well as companies. So at any given time, a driver could be working quite literally for two companies, have two apps open, or also be looking for instance, if you're a taxi, street work as well. So from that perspective. So really, ultimately, what we're looking for is, to have the right both value proposition for drivers to want to work with Bolt. So we end up competing quite literally with everyone. And we are a challenger. We're actually quite a small player in comparison. So we are also working, as much as we're competing, I looked down the panel, we're all competing with each other. I actually think it ultimately brings a better level of service and choice, both for passengers and for drivers because of it.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Kimberly said. Competition is really important for passengers. There are thousands of operators across the UK, which I think is a really good thing. We're competing against lots of other forms of transport, but we're also competing against the private car as well, and encouraging people to leave their car at home.
I'd take a completely different view, as you might expect. If I can give just a prime example, in Tunbridge Wells in Kent, Uber have been granted a licence recently. There is a partnership between adjacent boroughs, and what we're seeing, it's adjacent to us, but it's not affecting us directly. But what we're seeing are Uber vehicles taking fares that are being heavily subsidised by Uber. So a £7.50 fare is being paid £7.50 to the driver. The general public is being charged £2.50 for that. In a kind of a deliberate strategy of making life very difficult for the taxi companies to compete. So when it comes to competition, I think there is very much a battle between local taxi companies and incoming national or global players that are looking at achieving domination before that whole reversal of pricing comes into play when the significant, call it investment, but the significant losses that they've accumulated over the last 10 years come to play.
Yeah, I mean, we're a national operator, but we're not app only. We take about 30% of our bookings over the phone still, so we sort of sit in that sort of traditional and app space, if you like. And our model is we acquire local operators, but we keep the local teams in place, and we very much offer that sort of local service. I think there is a lot of competition in the market, but I think it's important that markets are very different throughout the UK. If we think of London, there's lots of different modes of transport, there's lots of options that passengers have. In some areas where we operate, over 50% of journeys that we fulfil are for essential bookings. So people trying to get to the hospital, picking up their shopping, they are regular bookings. So I think it's challenging to look at the entire UK or England or Wales, however you want to look at it, and say there's a sort of a one size fits all, and there are just different journey profiles and different needs depending on the locality.
Could I ask, particularly Kimberly and Emma, about an issue that's been raised with me by somebody who was on an Uber ride, where the model is such that if the driver needs another ride, needs to get another fare, they're all the time coming up on their app, on their screen, while they're driving, is the next ride, and they have to keep swiping to decide whether to take that fare or not. They're being distracted from driving. Has that issue been raised with you? Because it certainly concerns me that drivers are being distracted in order to make sure they keep the fares. They don't earn a lot. They need every fare they can get.
So it's really important that people aren't distracted while they're driving. There is no requirement for drivers to interact with their phone, and they don't, I think as the example suggests, have to accept or reject any trip. The offers will come through and they can ignore them, and I think as you rightly described, there's new ones coming through all the time. So, it's really important to us in the design of our app, and we're thinking about it all the time, that is not causing any issues in terms of distraction.
New rides aren't always coming through all the time or not nearby, so they can't afford much downtime. So the reality is, as they're coming to the end of one ride, they don't want to miss an opportunity for the next nearby ride, surely.
I mean, the app is designed so that you can see it very clearly over here, and you just a single tap, and it shouldn't be significantly distracting. We have experts that look at this in great detail and focus on making sure that it's not distracting.
At Bolt, we've gone, and I can't speak for Uber, but it is important for us to make sure that drivers aren't distracted, and we want to give more controls to them. So we've actually allowed drivers to be able to create their minimum standards for an auto accept. So, for instance, where how much they want to earn per mile, the zones that they want to operate in, and so that way they're not being distracted. Even towards the end of the trip, they're automatically matched.
Okay. Well, that may raise some further questions in future. But many thanks for that. We've now gone to Scott on employment rights.
Yeah, so thank you. It is slightly broader. I think the first question, I think I can predict the answer. So there is a suggestion in the evidence that the app-based companies are focusing too much on their business model and not enough on compliance. I think I predict the answer. Is there any truth in this, that your business model comes before compliance with your local licensing arrangements? I'm guessing.
I can go first. Again, I have a 200-person team, and that only focuses on the UK. 100 people are dedicated to compliance and to safety and upholding our licenses. So I would actually argue the opposite. We have we started talking about national standardization because we have 3,900 individual requirements. We can't not uphold those. We actually are exceeding the standards on all of them, and it requires a significant amount of effort to do that.
And you could say the same, I assume, Emma?
Absolutely. Compliance is super important to us, and there's no trade-offs being made there.
Okay. And so I say, perhaps a more legitimate concern is that in many jurisdictions you operate, understand you don't have a physical presence in terms of a person, a contact point. You may have a phone number or an email address, but you don't have a physical person. So what does that mean for interactions with you? If your customer wants to speak to someone face-to-face, or one of your drivers, or somebody from the local authority, or perhaps even your local trade union representation, is that a barrier?
So firstly, we do have local offices. So we have offices in Nottingham.
Are staffed?
Yeah,
okay.
Nottingham, Manchester, Birmingham, and of course London.
And every jurisdiction, sorry?
Sorry?
In every jurisdiction you have an office?
Where licenses require, we have an office, but they're not all manned office requirements. But what we do have, so firstly from a license and a local authority perspective, I think I had mentioned before, on a literal one-to-one basis, we have contacts with every licensing authority. We have dedicated, so firstly, a law enforcement portal, so anybody can ask for information at all times. We have a dedicated email and phone number if there are any questions or from a council perspective. From a passenger and from a driver perspective, we offer in-app, on phone, 24/7 essentially support, especially in cases of emergency. And then I think I had mentioned any complaints or incidents, especially complaints, are resolved within 8 hours. 75% are resolved within 8 hours. So we have a dedicated team ensuring that across all jurisdictions that we're serving both passengers, drivers, and also local authorities.
What about you, Emma? Do you think you'd benefit from having a physical presence in each licensing authority?
We don't think there should be a physical presence in every single licensing authority. We, like Kimberly, have what we call green light hubs that are local to almost every area, and we use those to support our relationships with licensing authorities and compliance, but they're also open to drivers at any time of day to come in and resolve issues. We have a specialist cities team who own the relationships with all of their licensing authorities. They know all of their key and relevant officers. They're often a WhatsApp message away. They go to all of their trade meetings.
Okay.
So, sorry, can I pick up on that? Just part of an answer on that. And I can only talk about my experience, and my experience in Medway is that there are now less than 400 locally licensed drivers, and that one of the reasons for that is there are several hundred Uber drivers that are operating locally. There is no local licence. Uber are not locally licensed at all. These are drivers that are driving 30 miles outside of London where they were licensed. So I just I take exception to the fact that not only is there not an Uber presence, but they're not even licensed, which gives significant problems as far as I'm concerned in enforcement and safety.
What would one of your customers do, Emma, if they wanted to speak to an Uber member of staff face to face?
You can call us. We have all of the same.
No face to face opportunity for.
No, not generally, but I think even local operators are covering very large areas. I think, as Mark referred to, there's 300,000 people living in the Medway area, and most of the time, what people want is ease of access. So they want to be able to get to see them via our in-app support functions or on the phone. We have specialist trained safety agents who are trained to help people, particularly when challenging situations or safety events occur, who are particularly trained bespoke to help people who have been victims or what have you. We think it's important is the quality of the interaction and the ease of access and the fact that they can get us any time of day.
Sorry, yeah, no.
I was going to move on to the next question if you wanted to.
No, go on. Well, I'm sorry. Elsie, did you want to come in on one of these points?
Very quickly on that point, Emma. Greater Manchester has a population of 3 million people. Do you know how many offices Uber has in Greater Manchester?
I'm not sure, but we do have one very large green light hub.
You've got one office. Do you think that's sufficient?
We do. It's staffed all day. It's open all week. There are round-the-clock services there. It's very large. It's very readily accessible, and we have drivers come in and work with us all the time. Nonetheless, as I say, our cities team, who own all the relationships with their licensing authorities, go out and meet their licensing authorities, and we have people based in Manchester whose job it is to own those relationships, and they do know the people well.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Scott.
Okay. So Emma, it feels like in some parts of the UK there's a real saturation of Uber drivers, and there's more and more getting registered all the time. And I guess that's good for consumers because it means when they want an Uber, their 99% chance it's going to come, and it's going to come quite quickly. And it's really good for you as a company because it means that every opportunity for you to earn money is met. And I accept that it's a legitimate aim for a company to make money. But the driver's not paying the price for this because they're competing harder and harder to get rides, and it means they're earning less and less money per hour. So are the drivers paying the price for this business model?
That's not a characterisation I think that we would reflect. What we see and what we continue to see in the UK is that demand for our services continues to grow and grow and grow, and we need more drivers, not fewer, and we see that is likely to be the continued pattern.
So if you include waiting time, are drivers' earnings rising or coming down in relation to inflation?
So we pay drivers for their time on trip, and that will be because...
waiting time is important, isn't it?
Waiting time is important, but I think the thing that the committee should understand is that quite often what is the case is that drivers are working for lots of operators. They could be working with all four parties here, and they would likely be online on all of those apps all at the same time, and that's good for drivers because they have competition in terms of the offers that are made to them, and we compete, for their time as much as anything else. And we think that gives the best outcome for them and the best flexibility of earnings, and we think they earn well.
Okay. And this crossed my mind earlier when Kimberly was speaking. So if a driver is struggling to earn money on your service, do you have limitations in terms of how long they could work on a shift? Is that a limitation you place in your app?
Go ahead. Yeah, we have a 10-hour limitation. Yeah, that's a safety.
But then that driver could run 10 hours with your app and then switch over to Kimberly's app.
In theory, they could do so. I mean, we'd strongly encourage them not to do that. It's important. And
there's nothing to stop them from doing that?
No, there's nothing to stop them from doing that, other than the fact that I guess it's a licensed profession, and they have a responsibility to uphold safe standards and be a safe driver and ensure that they're well rested.
But if your business model was making it harder and harder for them to earn a living, those temptations are always going to be there, aren't they?
We wouldn't accept that it is making it harder and harder for them to earn a living. We think that this style of work...
You don't know if earnings are coming up or down in relation to inflation, including waiting time.
So earnings are broadly as they are. They're £30 an hour on the Uber app when you're logged in. It's very difficult because...
That includes vehicle maintenance and that doesn't include waiting time, so that's slightly misleading.
So the thing to understand is that earnings vary. They'll be very different per trip, per where you're going, area of the country, time of year. It's quite seasonal. And so it's difficult to kind of describe precisely what's going on. We had Frontier Economics, who we commissioned last year to look into this for us. They determined that the average driver that's working sort of full-time or in the region of 30 hours a week is making about £43,000 pre-cost and post-cost about £36,000 as a median. And that is broadly in line with the kind of UK average earnings. So we think that we offer a good opportunity to drivers. That's why it continues to be very popular and more drivers join the app every day.
But, independent analysis suggests that drivers are earning much, much less than that. I mean, but I guess we can disagree with that. So can we move on to deactivation? I think, Kimberly, you raised a good example of when you would deactivate a driver who's accused of not respecting the rights of a disabled person. You said you would deactivate and then you would investigate. So I guess there comes two questions with that, and I guess it applies to other operators as well. What's the threshold for deactivating? I guess you don't deactivate a driver just because they're talking too much to the passenger. There must be some threshold. And secondly, if the accusation is to be found to be false, that driver's lost earnings, do you compensate them for that?
So firstly, you're right. We wouldn't deactivate a driver for talking too much.
So what is the threshold then?
Yeah, and neither would we deactivate a passenger for talking too much. I mean, these are just thresholds that one wouldn't define. But what we do take seriously are things like fraud and safety incidents. Again, we do have a team that investigates each incident, and any question of whether or not a driver should be deactivated. Firstly, they're both permitted to give, they're encouraged to give evidence or to have the conversation. It's reviewed by a human. This is not an automated thing. We take it very seriously because it is a driver's livelihood. And especially in fraud cases, they have 30 days to appeal the decision. So we put both all of the controls in place to make sure that we're taking a thorough investigation of any of these incidents, and in particular if it's something related to safety and fraud.
So let's pretend the complaint is malicious. You deactivate the driver. Do they get compensation for that?
Sorry, when you say malicious, you mean it's incorrect?
Yeah, so there's a spurious complaint.
If after the investigation it's found to have been malicious.
There's lots of earnings there, isn't there? And that's unfair on the driver fundamentally.
I don't. So I'm not aware of cases where that has been that's been the case. But I'm happy.
I think humanity is restored. That's great.
well, again, this is something that we take very seriously, and so we do a thorough review. Again, it's very manually reviewed. We have conversations directly with the driver. We ask for evidence, so we are thoroughly reviewing it. But I can review that and come back with if you'd like a written response on that.
Yeah, I mean, Emma, what would be the threshold in terms of a complaint from a customer to deactivate a driver? Obviously, it's a big step, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important, and we take it extremely seriously because it has an impact on drivers, as it does if we, are not maintaining a safe service on passengers. We have lots of the similar processes as Kimberly described. We investigate the complaint very thoroughly. It's difficult to say what precise threshold is because it varies quite a lot depending on what type of issue we're talking about. It's extremely rare that it's like a one-time complaint, and that's something that we are deactivating for. So usually it's about patterns that we are looking out for that can indicate risk in the future. That said, we take it really seriously. We ask for testimony for everybody involved in relation to that complaint. We look at data that's available to us. We can see a lot in relation to GPS and things that go on around a trip. CCTV is increasingly becoming a very important part of that. And then finally, I would say is that any decision that we do make is appealable. We have, with the GMB, which is our union partner, introduced a review process, either where they can appeal and be represented by their union or through the app in a review centre.
Thank you.
So I think for all of you, are your processes, do they sort of tick the boxes in terms of natural justice? Is it a completely transparent process that who is going to investigate what, at what level, by what time period, what the appeal process is, the time period? Is all of that set out? Can drivers clearly see that? Because I have a lot of constituents who lose their income overnight and struggle to know, or tell me that they struggle to know what the process is to get their activation back and sometimes their licence. Andrew?
Yes, but I think it's important to factor in the licensing authority in this because they are ultimately they license the driver partners, and the relationship with them between the operators and the licensing authority is really important in terms of the information sharing, making sure that they're fully aware of any historical issues. And you're right, taking the decision to deactivate or fully remove a driver from the system is it's a tough decision to take, but ultimately, as an operator, we're licensed for public safety, to be fit and proper in that sense, and we have to always.
Yeah, I'm just asking about your process, your justice processes.
We have local driver teams that will, always get the driver's side of any issue, but ultimately, if there's a concern, there's a public safety or passenger safety issue there, we have to take that seriously, and we have to go to the licensing authority to
I mean, there's fraud as well has been mentioned, but do you set out timescales? Do you set out processes? Are they clear? And do you operate within them? Sort of yes or no, really.
Yes, as far as we're concerned. I mean, it helps that we know all of our drivers personally, and there is that relationship, so it's a little bit different.
Yes, we communicate with drivers as soon as we have a complaint that might lead to a suspension where we need to investigate, and they will be spoken to and they will have sort of clarity over that process. We have found in the last 4 years where we've had our relationship with GMB that's been a hugely helpful support for drivers who are going through that process as well, and that they can have peer drivers help them with that.
Yes, to echo everything the panel has already said. In addition, we obviously also operate things called drivers' hubs, where drivers can either schedule or be able to drop in at any time to ask questions. We do bolt-on-the-move events where we gather feedback if anything is unclear. And we've got a team that's dedicated to making sure from a communication standpoint we're continually improving our comms.
Okay, I just had one other question, particularly, I think, for Mark, possibly to Andrew. Do you find that terms and conditions for your drivers are being driven down by the use of, the increased use of the Bolt, Uber, etc., or not? Is that not a factor?
In the area in which we work, the tariffs are set by the local authority, which I think is a key issue. The earnings of drivers, I think, have have reduced over the last 4 or 5 years because of increased competition and, as I mentioned earlier, different pricing strategies of incoming and in most cases, or in all cases, unlicensed vehicles operating in the area.
Andrew?
Do you say terms and conditions?
Well, yeah, the terms, conditions, by that I include income.
Yeah,
and working hours.
I wouldn't say significantly. I think there is more competition in areas where we operate, and I think it's a challenge situation. Obviously, there are different types of pricing going on. There's dynamic pricing, there's subsidised pricing, and there's fixed pricing. And obviously, we've got the taxi sector in there with fixed tariffs. So I think it's an issue that perhaps could be looked at, but I don't think it's a significant challenge.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time in terms of your evidence and your time today. That brings our first panel to an end. As we said to all our witnesses, if there's anything else you want to pick up in more detail and get back to us, feel free to do so in writing fairly quickly, please. So I'm going to suspend the meeting for a few minutes while our next witnesses take their places and we make sure the online setup is working. Thank you very much. Thanks. Order. Order, and welcome to our second panel, and please could I ask you to introduce yourselves. I'll start with Emma. Welcome back, Emma.
Hi there, thank you everyone. I'm Emma Vogelmann. I am the co-CEO of the Disabled Persons Organisation Transport for All.
Thank you. And could I just remind colleagues to say your name and as you ask questions, because it's difficult for people online to see who's speaking. James?
Morning, I'm James Button. My name, forgive me. My name is James Button. I am representing the Institute of Licensing, of which I'm the president. By profession, I'm a solicitor, and I also chair the Institute's Taxi Consultation Panel.
Good morning, I'm Saskia Garner. I'm the Head of Policy and Campaigns at the Suzy Lamplugh Trust. We're a personal safety, stalking and harassment charity, and we've been campaigning for, I think it's 30 years now, for improved safety in taxi and private hire vehicle licensing.
Hi, I'm Councillor Shah. I'm leader of Oldham Council, but I'm here in the capacity as the recent chair of the Neighbourhoods Committee for the LGA.
Welcome. So, I think you may have picked up our previous session. So what aspects of the Department for Transport's 2020 statutory standards aren't working effectively to ensure safe and reliable travel for all passengers? Emma?
Absolutely, thank you. I think when it comes to the 2020 standards, what we're still missing is the very national standard and the inconsistency across licensing authorities. So for disabled people, it still provides a large amount of ambiguity in terms of what type of what type of journey that they might experience depending on the requirements of that particular licensing authority.
Okay, thank you. James?
The Institute is of the view that there should be national mandatory standards. The guidance is good, but the requirement to have regard to it allows local authorities, as licensing authorities, to depart from it if they feel so. It needs to be enshrined in law, and those need to be absolute standards, not minimum standards.
I agree with James's points. The Suzy Lamplugh Trust has actually evidenced the fact that statutory guidance are being ignored in some areas. We sent a Freedom of Information request to all licensing authorities. 28 were able to give us a more detailed breakdown of which of their recently, in the prior 2 years, licensed and renewed licensed drivers held convictions and for what, and at least 90 active licences were held with drivers for convictions for violent offences including assault, battery, violence, abuse and sexual offences, and that was following the issuance of those standards, and that is only a small proportion of the licensing authorities, so we fear this is the tip of an iceberg. Clearly, in some cases they're being ignored. We need national standards embedded in legislation.
Arooj?
Thank you. So I think inconsistent with what colleagues have said, I think when they came into play in 2020, the LGA welcomed them at that point, but actually learning has taught us, and that experience as well, that we have to strengthen them a lot more. The failure of having, or the lack of national minimum standards, means that we cannot enforce, licensing authorities cannot enforce licences that have been issued outside of their borough, which creates lots of safeguarding issues for us. And I just think that national standards is something that we're all desperately calling for. It provides safety, not just for our passengers, but for drivers too.
Okay, thank you. So you've all made a very strong and consistent point. But even where we have standards, we've heard the standards described as, quote, open to interpretation. How might they be tightened up? Emma, do you want to go first?
Absolutely. So where I think they fall short is in the specific. So I think in terms of accessibility, we need to have more specific standards. We need to also look at the provision of wheelchair accessible vehicles, and we also need to look at driver training. What we completely agree with, that was also mentioned, is that the guidance uses very weak language, so may request information or should, but not that sort of more enforceable language, and completely agree in terms of the cross-border licensing. We would very much want that to be tightened up to make sure that concerns that are in one licensing authority are shared with others where that driver does move to drive in those areas. We'd also really like to see the standards bring in more, as I said, on accessibility. So it focuses quite a lot on safeguarding, which is wonderful, and road safety, but it doesn't capture things such as refusal rates that disabled passengers experience from drivers. It doesn't capture overcharging instances, the availability of wheelchair accessible vehicles, or even the digital platform accessibility.
Thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. James?
The standards need to be enshrined in legislation. Having guidance is all very well, but it remains simply guidance. In terms of what they should cover, for drivers, it should cover criminal and other unacceptable activity. The Institute issued guidance on this, on which the Department based its guidance in 2020. That Institute guidance has since been updated, and we hope that the DFT may update their guidance. Beyond that, consistency on medicals, age, driving tests, disability training, county lines training, spoken and written English, all these need to be standard across the country. It is absurd that somebody can pass a test in one district and fail in another. For operators, again, character, as I've already stated, exactly the same as for drivers. Data protection compliance, clear complaints procedures, clear record keeping, again standardised across the country. information to hirers in advance, for vehicles, age or emissions tests, the maintenance requirements, size, the frequency of testing, CCTV. Wheelchair accessible vehicles are an issue which I'm sure we'll come on to. We've already heard this morning about the costs. But the other thing that I would mention is that there are changes happening in Wales, and it is really vital that there should be a common approach between England and Wales. Otherwise, problems will be exacerbated.
Thank you. Saskia, anything to add?
So, to add, we support the Institute of Licensing's suitability guidance, which sets out a very clear and sensible framework in which the crimes and behaviours carried out by drivers previously relate to the extent to which they should be prevented from being receiving a licence in the future. It's not a standard block. It's a very sensible framework to consider the risk to passengers according to the offending history. And we know as a frontline service that the conviction rate for many offences is actually very low. So we strongly believe that this information should be shared, should include non-conviction data. I think we were talking in the previous panel about locally available information, complaints, cautions, and in fact complaints made to operators. I know there have been issues in the past where those haven't actually always been passed on to the police. We do support mandated national driver training. This needs to be accredited and it needs to have input from specialist victim services to reflect those experiencing those behaviours from drivers, and we also support continuous video and audio in vehicles, which we think would not only go some way to assuring drivers of their own safety, but prevent disputes about whether these crimes have taken place.
Anything else to add, Arooj?
No, I think you're going to find that
was a very comprehensive list.
And I think the LGA have a database called the NR3S database, which is a crucial tool to support councils in determining whether licence holders are fit and proper, but there are inconsistencies, just as Saskia's mentioned. So we're calling for a national database, which means that we can have greater information before we're giving licences to people. And then obviously, when you've got out-of-borough licences, that makes it even more difficult to determine whether taxi drivers are fit and proper. And actually, the trade themselves are calling for greater standards in this regard as well.
Okay, Scott, you had a particular question to pick up on Saskia and videos.
Yeah, so thanks for making the point about video, Saskia, and I'm now kicking myself for not asking this in the previous session where video and audio recording came up. So I don't want to lead you too much into your answer, but what kind of access arrangements do you want around that recorded data? So you've got a taxi or an Uber where you're recording the video and audio. Do you want the driver to routinely have access to that? Or is that more just for where there's actual issues to be investigated?
I think so, and I think that would have to come under the regulations of the Information Commissioner. As I understand it, there are strict regulations around how these kinds of materials are kept, so that obviously they're only kept for a short amount of time and when requested in relation to specific concerns or reports of crimes. So there would obviously need to be very strict regulation around that, but in principle we think it's an important aspect.
If I may, we would suggest that the access is only available to the police or a specified licensing officer in the event of a complaint, and that's how the systems work that exist at the moment.
Okay.
And just to add, sorry if I could, Chair, just to add to that point, there is, where you do have CCTV, it's not always a case that you have audio available. There have been instances where CCTV has been made available, but the audio isn't always captured. So I think consistency in that is really important.
Useful detail. Baggy Shankar.
Thanks, Chair. Baggy Shankar, one of the committee members. You've all sort of joined already widespread calls in what you've said so far in the implementation of a national standard for taxis and private hire vehicles. And I don't think, James, you've given a pretty comprehensive list in your previous answer. But for the rest of you, what other elements should be included in that standard, do you think?
I think the one that I would really strongly call for is the national database. I think that is a massive issue for licensing authorities. There are instances, especially with the way the new DBS is carried out, that the DBS filter some convictions. So actually at the point where you're licensing individuals, you do not have access to all that information, and in some instances I know there's a charge that the police put onto the licensing authority to obtain that, and I think that is a real huge concern from a safeguarding perspective. Filtering those convictions means that you do not know at the point that you are issuing a licence the full scale of convictions that a licensee may have.
I agree with that, and in addition I think that national enforcement powers for licensing officers is critical to enforce the national standards that we are proposing to ensure that there aren't obstacles to making those assessments.
And I think that's a real strong point, because, so for example, if you were licensed from Oldham and you have a taxi that has been licensed by, say, for example, Rotherham, our licensing officers cannot enforce that individual, even though they are working in that borough at that point in time.
And on the back of that, you also need consistent fee levels to stop licence shopping, and fee sharing, so that the enforcement that is taken by Rochdale against the Rotherham driver and vehicle, those costs can be recovered, because otherwise the authorities that have the vehicles in their area just do not have the resources to undertake the enforcement, even if those enforcement powers were available, which they should be.
Emma, anything to add?
Sorry.
Yeah, you're on.
Sorry, thank you. I wasn't able to unmute myself. Apologies. So in terms of what Transport for All believes should be in the national standard, so we absolutely would like accessibility to be featured. So having a minimum proportion of fleets be wheelchair accessible vehicles and having that be shared with the public, having accessible booking options for taxis and private hires, disability equality training. We know that that is quite inconsistent, with only about 2/3 of licensing authorities requiring some type of disability training, but we would like for that training to be in that national standard, and specifically for it to be designed and delivered by disabled people and with that pan impairment focus. We would also like to see complaints processes in that national standard brought up to scratch, so making sure that complaint systems for individuals who experience issues with their journeys are accessible to them, that they know what to expect from either the operator or the licensing authority in terms of timeframes, and to bring into the fit and proper, making sure that that explicitly includes things around access refusals if there's been any damage to mobility aids on the part of disabled passengers, and if there's any type of discriminatory behaviour at all.
Okay, thank you. Lawrence, you wanted to pick up a point here.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It was a follow-up question to Emma, if I may, and Lawrence Turner. Emma, we've heard from the previous panel and elsewhere that not only is there the problem of around 1/3 of authorities not requiring training, but there's a variation in the quality of the training that is provided. Can you tell us some more about what that variation looks like, and what practically can the government do to raise standards and consistency of the training itself?
Absolutely. So we absolutely, and we've seen this across every single mode of transport, and I think really every single sector, that where there isn't a standard for what disability equality training or assistance provision or any type of training regarding disabled people or how to assist disabled people, there's such inconsistency. So Transport for All is always going to advocate for that training to be designed and delivered by disabled people, because that is the only way that real experiences are going to be shared, and really practical advice and steps to follow are going to be given to those who are performing that service. So for us, it would absolutely need to be explicit that this training must be designed and delivered by disabled people and organisations that represent disabled people as well.
Okay. Can I, on this point?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. And Emma, if you have examples of local authorities that you think are doing it very well and those that you think are not doing so well, I think we'd be interested to have that in writing. Thank you.
Absolutely, I can share that.
Thank you. I've got a question for James and Arooj. You talk about having a common set of standards. In fact, all of you have said that. How easy, from your perspective, from the licensing authority's perspective, how easy do you think it would be to reach consensus on what should be a common standards? And would there be some areas that might be controversial or contested?
I mean, I think in this regard, I think a political sort of commitment to just ensure that we have standards is something that I think most decent people would call for. The trade themselves are asking for this. They felt really vulnerable themselves recently with all these, especially after Baroness Casey's recommendations. So they feel like they want to set a standard for their trade that they've done for a very long time. But passengers equally, I think you will have consistency. I think the problem is at the moment, Chair, because people, like James said, can shop around as it stands today, it means that we are not able to even enforce the basic minimum standards that you would expect licensing authorities to do. Some licensing authorities really pride themselves on having really high standards, but actually the inability that we can't control if residents from our borough want to go somewhere else where standards are a lot more less lenient, we can't control that, and actually that impacts the confidence from a passenger perspective and from a trade perspective. And I think there might be issues around environmental sort of elements of this, and then I know there's some, the LGA's long push for equality and mandatory training, even as far as equality is concerned. All licensing authorities don't even implement that. We can encourage it, but we can't mandate them to do that, and I think that is really important to build confidence from the public, but for the trade as well.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned one where there's different views from different areas is emissions. Others that might be controversial are language requirements and the local knowledge requirement. James, where do you think these decisions should be made? If assuming we're going to a common set of standards,
they have to come from central government. The Greater Manchester authorities have failed to achieve a set of common standards despite working on it for many, many years. It is incredibly difficult to get local authorities to agree. Even neighbouring authorities don't agree on their standards. It has to come from central government. I think it will be difficult, and the concern that I think we have, and I suspect it's other people have it, is that if we're not careful, they will simply be the lowest common denominator, and they must be good absolute standards, because otherwise they're meaningless.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there'll be consensus over that. Baggy, did you want to come in and see Alex
just
wants to come in?
You mentioned earlier on, James, the work being done in Wales to get to some agreed standards. Are there any lessons learned from the work already done in Wales that the rest of us could learn?
I think the lessons that are learned are that it takes a very long time, and without serious political drive from the centre, it will just drift.
Okay, and then just finally, I mean, I know we're all talking about the need for national standards and the benefits, but does anybody see any drawbacks of having national standards?
No.
No.
Can I just add that the Task and Finish group in 2018 was a cross-party, cross-sector group, and there are unanimous recommendations in there, including for national standards.
Alex?
I think this is probably specifically to James, but what about having regional standards as a midway point? Because you made the point that the authorities in Manchester can't agree, but if the power goes to the mayoral combined authority, as to some extent is the situation in London, would that be a halfway house, or would that be a good idea, or should we just go the whole way and go to national standards?
There are 2 points there, if I may. Firstly, the Institute doesn't see any advantage in going to regional bodies. It will simply lead to larger variations in standards, especially at a time when local authorities are facing upheaval through local government reorganisation. It also risks diluting the smaller licensing departments because they will lose their taxi people to regions. Secondly, no, I don't think regional standards would make a difference, because you would have a high standard in Manchester, a lower standard in Birmingham for the sake of argument, and the Birmingham drivers, the Manchester people would go to Birmingham because it's going to be easier to get the licence. It's got to be across the country.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. Arooj, you mentioned the KC audit a little while ago, and that audit, as you know, did say that the government will legislate to address the important issues, including in relation to passenger safety. My question to the panel is, what should this legislation include? And I think, Arooj, perhaps we start with you and work our way down the panel, and then come to Emma finally.
I think the national database is a really, really important element to this. I think if you're going to instill public confidence, both for the trade and the passengers, we have to have or be aware of the relevant information for that licensee holder. Not to have that and to have it in such an inconsistent way is a huge safeguarding concern. I think the filtering of the convictions from the new database, so the new DBS, the way they filter the convictions even before they provide them to the authority, and we don't even get that information from the police, there's inconsistency there as well, poses a real huge safeguarding concern. So I think I would be really pushing for that as a minimum. But yeah, I think that's one of the main things that I would call for.
Thank you. Yes, I think, as I've said, the national standards embedded in that legislation is key, and with that, the enforcement powers to enforce it. I agree with the national database around information sharing, including non-conviction data and local information. I also think that it's essential that driving a taxi or private hire vehicle becomes a regulated activity. It is currently entirely possible that someone who is on the current barred lists for regulated activity, and whilst we know from the Department for Transport that those lists are being viewed by licensing authorities, there is actually no guarantee, and there's nothing to prevent someone on either of those barred lists being given a licence to drive a private hire vehicle or a taxi. So I think that is a crucial part that should be included in legislation as well.
James.
Yes, the national database, I agree entirely. It should be accessible to operators as well. We need statutory timescales for information to be input into it. The other problem with the NR3S is that whilst there is reference to a driver having been revoked in one district and a new application is made elsewhere, that information is obtained, but then the second authority that they've applied to can depart from that and can grant a licence. The inconsistency in decision-making within local authorities is a major problem, and the Institute takes the view that these decisions should be made by professional licensing officers rather than by panels of elected councillors. There have been far too many departures where that has caused difficulties. In addition, there should be trained benches of magistrates to deal with licensing matters because, again, matters are overturned far too often by magistrates' court when the local authorities actually made a robust decision. The other element would be greater involvement by the police. At the moment, the police will give some information occasionally on enhanced DBSs. It is completely inconsistent. It is entirely at the discretion of the Chief Constable. There is no formal involvement with the police in the licensing process. You can contrast that with, for example, the Licensing Act, which is a far better and more robust system. All of those should be involved in these new statutory standards.
Thank you.
Emma.
I would completely echo everything that's already been said, particularly around the information sharing between the police and the licensing authority. I think we would also be calling for a mandatory recording and reporting on safety-related incidents, so things, as I mentioned, like access refusals and overcharging. I think those are two other really important considerations I would bring in. But I think one pretty glaring omission that's sort of there at the moment is a definition of passenger safety that explicitly includes aspects relating to disabled passengers. So safety must include things like safe boarding and disembarking, proper securing of wheelchairs and mobility aids, or not leaving a passenger in an unsafe place, or having a refusal, not suffering discriminatory or hostile treatment, and things like that. So just those are my additions, but I agree with everything that's been said.
Thank you very much. Maggie, are you okay?
Thank you, Chair.
14.
To Councillor Shah first, if I may. Many passengers would reasonably assume that a DBS check on a driver would sort of, I won't say guarantees, but ensures their safety a lot better. But evidence to us from the Suzy Lamplugh Trust shows that cases where individuals with offending histories have still been licensed. Can you explain why this happens in practice?
Inconsistency with each licensing authority. So the police and the general national database information sharing is an obvious one, but actually if you draw down to local licensing authorities, there's inconsistencies because the people who decide so for example, if you have a conviction, you go in front of a licensing panel. The licensing panel is made up of individuals who will base their decision on the evidence provided to them or their personal opinion on something. I think that has an element of risk to it. I think it should be really clear and the standards should be set that are really high. If you have a conviction of a specific type especially, the reality is that those people should then not be given a license to drive, because you are then saying, and if you are a passenger, you are getting into a taxi assuming that all those checks and balances have been done. So you're going in there with a confidence and an assurity that somebody's actually held or driven really high standards, and actually there's too much inconsistency in the system to allow that to happen. Lots of different licensing authorities are really lenient, but you have individuals making them decisions, and I don't think that they are fully equipped with all the information to make them at that point in time. It's very daunting if you think about it.
Okay, and just opening up to the rest of the panel, what do you think the impact of this is from a safety perspective?
Well, I think our research and our evidence shows that the wrong decisions are being made and unsafe decisions are being made despite national guidance, and clearly because it's guidance it is being inconsistently and inadequately applied, and the impact of this is that some passengers are being subject to crimes by drivers, and we are a victim-led organisation, and we work with the family of Shah O'Callaghan, who was murdered by a licensed private hire vehicle driver, and he was known to the police in various ways. He didn't have a conviction history, back to my point about patterns of behaviour. Every incident where a passenger is subject to criminal behaviour by a driver is one too many, and the impact on those people's lives is immense. So I would say I would really urge that no further delay in bringing this into law, given that the wrong decisions are being made at a local level.
Echoing what Councillor Shah said, councils have policies on this. I think every council has a policy, but in the committee room, those policies are departed from. They're departed from for the wrong reasons. The sole consideration is public safety. The High Court has made that crystal clear. But unfortunately, departures are made for other reasons, personal reasons, family reasons, and so on. The difficulty is that this leads to somebody being licensed as a driver who wouldn't be licensed as a driver elsewhere. The idea that the public don't appreciate that a driver can be refused in one authority or revoked in one authority and then legitimately licensed in another is ridiculous. If you compare it, for example, to airline pilots, a pilot isn't licensed to fly in the United Kingdom, but is licensed to fly in America. Nobody would get on an aeroplane on that basis. So why should the public get into a taxi on the same basis?
If I could add to that from a disabled passenger's perspective, completely agree everything that was mentioned, just wanting to include, any type of discriminatory behaviour or practice from taxi drivers. Again, as was really well said, any instance of that is one too many. I think in terms of the guidance, it creates almost a bit of a good practice ceiling by saying that, look, that authorities should do this. But what we really need is for enforceable standards to be brought in. I think in terms of the disabled person's perspective, I hate to use this phrase vulnerable, but I think there is no way of getting around that. For anyone, any passenger, but particularly for a disabled passenger, there is this level of vulnerability when you are in the vehicle of any taxi or PHV driver, and that there could be someone who is, as was mentioned, not allowed to be licensed in another area because of a particular criminal conviction or from a type of behavior is then completely able to be your driver is extremely concerning. I don't get the impression that many disabled people know about that. There already is a huge amount of fear when disabled people are using taxis and PHVs because of that level of vulnerability that I mentioned. But if this was made more public, then I think we would really see disabled people not wanting to use this as a mode of transport, which they unfortunately do have to rely on a lot more of the time because of inaccessible other modes of transport.
If I may, could I just add something? It's very easy to focus on the negative, and that's what we're doing because we're focusing on the problems. I think it's very important to recognise that the vast majority of people in the hackney carriage and private hire industries, drivers, operators, vehicle proprietors, are hard-working, decent, law-abiding people who generally provide very good services to the users. And I think that needs to be put on the record because it is very easy to think that they're all poor, and they're not. It's a small minority. Some of those are very poor, but it is still a very small minority.
And to add to that, if I may, the Task and Finish group, which, as I say, was cross-sector and represented, had unions there representing taxi drivers and private hire vehicle drivers, all agreed that we need these national standards to close the loophole on that very small minority of perpetrators who are using that position of authority in a locked vehicle to carry out those crimes, and it is bringing down the reputation of the industry, which in majority part are hard-working people who want to ensure that people have safe passage.
You want to come back in?
Yeah, and I just want just to add, because I agree with everything James and Saskia have said, in Greater Manchester, we have called for regional sort of licensing because out of borough licensing poses great issues for our taxi drivers there. 25% of our households do not have access to a private car. That's rising to 50% with poorer households. We have out-of-borough licences that come into Greater Manchester, operate their cars. Not only do they impact the livelihood of those trade and their families and wider communities, we have no knowledge of the convictions, if any of these licence holders have. It poses great risk to our communities, but also to the trade itself. We know that in the national context where the country is so divided, this trade specifically is feeling really, really targeted. They are asking and calling for these kind of standards. There's a specific community that feels more targeted than anybody else right now, and they are calling for these standards because they take great pride, like James said, in their work, and this is a livelihood for them. And actually many of them do not have the opportunity or the ability to sort of find jobs or have access to any other jobs. So there is a great risk in this, and I think the call for national standards is really important, but out-of-borough licences are really important. You can shop right now from anywhere across the country.
We've had a lot of evidence on out-of-borough licences. I think we know where our recommendations
that probably leads us nicely on to
next question.
On to the next question. Okay. So, should there be a statutory definition for fit and proper when it comes to drivers, and if so, what should that include? Do you want to start, James?
I think it's very difficult to have a statutory definition. Fit and proper is a very old legislative phrase. The Institute uses the term safe and suitable to explain what fit and proper means. The danger is that if you have a very strict statutory test, there will be no discretion. Again, you can contrast this with the Licensing Act. To have a personal licence under the Licensing Act to sell alcohol, you need to pass a Home Office approved test and not have any live convictions for a specific range of convictions contained in the Act. And really, there are very few other checks. Now, you could have something like that, but it then removes discretion. And the danger is, as with the Licensing Act, you can't take spent convictions into account, which the law allows you to do for taxi licensing. And you then have the situation that Saskia's explained, where serious matters are then overlooked or the authority can't get hold of it. The guidance issued in 2020, which gave a suggested test for fitness and propriety, has been extremely helpful. Ultimately, and I don't think there's a way around this, it will remain a subjective test. And I'm not certain that a statutory test is going to improve matters as long as there remains, as I think there should remain, an element of discretion in the decision-making process.
As soon as you allow discretion, do you then start drifting away from national standards?
You do, absolutely. But, for example, if you have a prohibition on having a licence if you've committed a sexual offence, and this is an example I use, somebody who was convicted of sex with an underage girl 35 years ago, he was 17, she was 15, it happens. They got married later on, they have children, he now wants to be a taxi driver. If you have an absolute bar, would you bar them? That's a question. I don't necessarily know what the answer is, but I would suggest it would be unreasonable. But once you have absolutes like that, then there will always be people who fall outside when they would be a perfectly good licensee. When you have people who aren't convicted and the police don't provide the information, they get the licence. So I think there has to be an element of flexibility. And I realise that this is a very hard circle to square, but this is where I think that with a lot of political will, and I mean small p political will, and the engaging with the industry and others like us involved, it could be achieved. I'm not for a moment saying it's going to be easy, but then nothing in life worth achieving is.
Anybody want to add anything?
Okay.
Emma's got a hand up.
Emma.
You're on mute again.
Apologies, I was on mute. I would like to come in and say that we at Transport for All, we would support a solid definition of this and a solid way of assessing, because I think, as you mentioned, as soon as discretion is brought in, it provides uncertainty. So for Transport for All's perspective, it really would provide a lot of comfort and safety to disabled passengers if there was a very strict, very transparent, and very fair process or a standard.
Thank you, Baggy. Jacob?
So we've spoken briefly about the police sharing data with local authorities, and there's been new guidance issued by the department in October this year. But James, you've said that that's still inadequate. So what reforms do you think need to be seen?
There are one or two constabularies where the information sharing with the local authorities in their area is good. In the vast majority of cases, it isn't. Common law police disclosure does not work. The interpretation of pressing social need from the Supreme Court decisions down makes it incredibly difficult for the police to make a decision on information sharing. For example, a driver arrested for rape on a Friday night. By Monday morning, the police say that is no longer a pressing social need. That is absurd. There has to be statutory rules to overcome the difficulties that the decisions within the court systems have placed on the police. In addition, when a new application for a driver is made, there should be statutory consultation with the police, not simply the DBS, and the police should be mandated to share information when somebody is arrested who is a licensee. A simple question: when you're arrested, do you hold a taxi licence of any sort? Yes. If so, issued by whom? And that information is then passed on to the licensing authority. That does not happen. It happens in a minority, and I mean 4-5% minority of cases. But the Institute has a great deal of information, of examples where information has not been forthcoming from the police, sometimes obtained months later, sometimes comes out at an appeal, and that person has been driving or licensed in the meantime, and it's simply not good enough.
Ruta, you've spoken a lot about a national database. Do you see this as a place where police can share that information with local authorities?
Yeah, because councils are really concerned, especially licensing panels have to make a decision about whether somebody's fit and proper. And I agree what James has said. Where another issue poses is because, say, for example, a previous licensee holder at the point of obtaining their licence had no conviction. Then the police are made aware that there's a conviction, say, on the Friday night. The police do not have a statutory responsibility to inform the licensing authority. So that means at that point, a licensing panel could be renewing somebody's licence but not have access to that information. So I think the statutory function for the police to inform local authorities and that information sharing is really important, especially in cases where they might subsequently have a conviction that the licensing authority is not aware of.
I completely agree with everything that's been said. And one thing that our research showed was that licensing authorities, whilst they obtained information about conviction and behavioural histories at the time of appointing a licence, didn't necessarily hold on to that information. And our concern would be that evidencing patterns of behaviour over a period of time is absolutely crucial. The Women and Equalities Committee have done research into the escalation of behaviours leading to serious violence. The Angelini inquiry, as you well know, has looked at this exact issue. We would strongly advocate that all information sharing includes all information, not only about convictions, but concerns, reports to, as Jim has made the point, are all currently eligible for decision making, but clearly this needs to be mandated.
Okay, thank you. I saw Scott and Alex have both got supplementaries. Scott?
Just very quickly, James, before I was elected here last year, I was a councillor in Edinburgh and I sat on the committee which dealt with taxi drivers. And I thought that the flow of information between the police and the local authority was actually really good, and the police actually were quite precautionary in their approach in terms of they would tell the council everything and we would allow the councillors to make a judgment on it. But you paint quite a different picture in England. So I just wanted to be clear about my experience. Does your experience allow you to compare what's happening in England with Scotland? Because certainly on this aspect in Edinburgh, it seemed much better than you've accounted.
Well, I'm delighted it is in Edinburgh. The problem is it isn't in the vast majority of areas in England and Wales.
Okay, right, thank you. Alex?
I was just a bit concerned we seem to be kind of using arrested, charged and convicted kind of interchangeably. And I wondered at what stage...
Reported, arrested, charged, convicted.
Because they are very different things, and just from the perspective of the driver as well. So at what stage do you actually think that information should be being passed across?
If I may, the decision as to whether somebody is or remains a fit and proper person is based on the civil test, the balance of probabilities. It is not based on the criminal test of beyond all reasonable doubt. And the High Court has made it clear that that is the case on a number of occasions. So if somebody is arrested, if there is a complaint, then the authority needs to have that information to be able to consider whether action is required. If they are subsequently charged, then that may escalate the issue. If they are subsequently convicted, then obviously that escalates the issue. But the point is, that public safety has to be paramount, is paramount, and that can only be achieved on the basis of dealing with matters when they arise, not 18 months later when there may or may not be a conviction.
That's helpful.
Just to add to that, I completely agree, and I just wanted to make the point that in a number of the serious behaviours that we're talking about here, such as rape and stalking, for example, the conviction rate is less than 3%. So
of complaints?
Of reports to the police.
Reports to the police, yeah, of course.
So
Sadly.
all the other information, somebody may have been charged multiple times. If we only go by convictions, that pattern of behaviour will not be reflected, and yet it is seriously concerning.
That's helpful. Thank you. Right, can we now move on? I'm very conscious of the time. Scott, on accessibility.
So thank you, Chair. And I think this was covered to some extent earlier by Emma's comments about wheelchair accessible vehicles. So Emma, my question was, do you think we should be mandating these in local authorities? And I think you've already said yes to that earlier. So I guess it's about how do we do that? Firstly, have you some idea of proportion in mind? How many vehicles, what proportion of vehicles should be accessible? And secondly, it wouldn't work, would it, in this kind of environment of cross-border taxi activity where an authority could absolutely do the right thing and demand a really good proportion of vehicles are accessible or wheelchair accessible, only to be swamped by drivers from surrounding local authorities who don't meet that criteria.
Unless we have common standards.
Yeah.
Emma.
That's exactly right. So I think in terms of having, what should that percentage or that quota be, I personally don't have an answer to that, but what we do know is that from Transport for All members is that they are, particularly anywhere outside of urban areas, there are next to no wheelchair accessible vehicle in terms of taxis. So there is a huge problem in terms of just the lack of vehicles. But one thing that I did want to mention is the current conversation that's being had around VAT exemption for disability vehicles, and looking at how we don't want to create sort of a barrier to individual drivers or to licensing authorities being to have wheelchair accessible vehicles on their fleets. But if we take away the VAT exemption on wheelchair accessible vehicles or adapted vehicles, then we're looking at even fewer vehicles being available than there are now, because it would cost more. So just wanted to bring that in there. I think in terms, as I said, in terms of a quota or a number, I don't have that. I do think that it should be proportionate to the population. I think it should be proportionate to the needs of that community. So I'd very much encourage licensing authorities to engage with local disability groups to try and paint a picture of what that demand would be.
Okay, thank you. Two very quick follow-ups, you don't Chair. So it's a bit of two perspectives on what's happening just now then, because I think I'm guilty of focused on wheelchair accessible vehicles, but accessible transport is, in terms of taxis and Ubers, etc., is much, much bigger than that. So I guess the first leading question is, do you think this is something that providers are taking seriously just now, doing as much as they can, even without that lack of without that minimum standard being in place? And also, of course, I'm right in saying, am I not, Emma, that for some people, in terms of accessible taxi travel, an ordinary Uber-type car or Bolt or whatever the provider is actually the best option for them. It's not always a black cab.
Yes, absolutely. I think the type of vehicle is completely it's completely down to the individual. So even amongst wheelchair users, a type of vehicle that, are both wheelchair accessible vehicles may be suitable for one person but not suitable for another. That could be because they need more room for medical equipment or the makeup of their wheelchair, whatever that might be. So I wouldn't want to prescribe only one type of vehicle. I do, however, think that the black cabs, in terms of the built-in accessibility and the provision of them, are really fantastic. in terms of accessible vehicles, you're absolutely right that it is not just wheelchair accessible vehicles. There are lots of other features that could be brought in, and some of that is driver decisions over things like, the temperature, the, windows, the sound, all of those things within the taxi. And those can't be regulated in the same way, having X amount of drivers agree to not have, music on or have loud noises on, because for some that is an incredible barrier for, to using taxis. So yeah, I would just add that and say that accessible vehicles really do vary from person to person. I think it's looking though at, are you attempting to meet that need? Or are you attempting to have different types of vehicles so you're anticipating that need within the community?
Okay.
And I think just sort of on my last point, in terms of the other accessibility modes or other modes of transport, is that there isn't enough that's being done to make more taxis on fleets accessible for all types of disabled people, which is a real barrier considering that sometimes these are the only option.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
I just, in terms of licensing authorities, would it be for James and Arooj, or James or Arooj, would it be workable for licensing authorities to be required to ensure that a certain proportion of the vehicles they license are wheelchair accessible, or what challenges would that mean in enforcing and monitoring that?
Some councils do mandate, especially the hackney carriages, to be fully wheelchair accessible, but I think the challenges there are some concerns that they can be really expensive to both buy and run. They have a much larger carbon footprint and have higher emissions of nitrogen dioxide.
So there'd have to be something external to ensure. Has any? Don't worry, it's just prayers. James, has there any thought been taken among licensing authorities about is there a workable way to have a minimum proportion of private hire vehicles, especially in areas where there's no hackney carriages, like London, where there's a common basic standard?
A provision could be made. The difficulty is who gets the short straw of having to have a wheelchair accessible vehicle over a saloon. So the only way that could work, I would suggest, is that there has to be some form of subsidy for the wheelchair accessible vehicles, which, as you've heard, cost 2-3 times as much as a standard saloon or estate car.
Okay, thank you. Elsie, I think.
Thanks, Chair. Elsie Blundell, Transport Select Committee member. I've got a couple of questions on refusals and driver training. Emma, I'm going to direct this one at you first, if I may. Given continued reports of passengers being refused journeys or overcharged, what changes are needed to make sure that protections brought in by the 2022 Taxis and Private Hire Vehicles Disabled Persons Act, what changes do we need to see to make sure those are properly enforced?
Absolutely. I think that there are explicit pieces of legislation that direct, against overcharging for wheelchair users, but for also disabled people more widely who may take more time to get in and out of the vehicle. However, what I have found, and this is, from what I've heard from other disabled people in our membership, but myself as an electric wheelchair user, is that the amount of times that we hear that drivers are unaware of that, of those obligations on them in terms of when to start and stop the meter. So I think that licensing authorities really need to be doing more to communicate these standards and these legal obligations to drivers, so that we're not in an instance of, well, has this taxi driver that I've booked with, do they happen to keep up with the news and the regulations on their industry, or do they not? And that is incredibly inconsistent. It's something I've had conversations with TfL about on how they could do better to make sure that drivers are aware, but also that passengers are aware, because passengers, myself included, can have a conversation with the driver if they notice that the meter has been started before they started getting into the vehicle, which we know is not permitted. And it really, it's a very difficult conversation for a passenger to have with the driver. You are in there's a power imbalance in that situation, which I think really does have to be addressed. And that's what I would really like to see regulators and licensing authorities really push those messages through to drivers much stronger, and I think also make them aware of the potential impact. Drivers that I've had conversations with are extremely surprised when they hear that fines are potentially going to be a result of this type of behavior. And what we also hear is that drivers say, oh, well, I've always done it this way. And that could be because previously or whenever they started, their career, it wasn't, a legal obligation, but it is now. And we need to make sure that drivers are being kept up to date on the laws that govern their sector. And that just isn't happening at the moment. We know that there are extremely high rates of refusals. So 26% of disabled people have experienced some type of access refusal, and this goes up to 63% for assistance dog handlers, and we know this very similar for wheelchair users like myself.
Thanks, Emma. And just quickly, I wondered, Arooj in particular, what practical challenges do licensing authorities face when it comes to monitoring compliance and taking action against breaches of the law when it comes to disabled people?
It often goes unreported, and I think because it's so much trauma for the individual that they often don't report it, and we don't have the ability to then collect that data, so that we're then unable to enforce against that licence holder.
That's helpful, thank you.
Could I just come back on that really quick? I think that is a really fair point, that a lot of disabled people don't make complaints. However, I would say that it isn't just trauma-based that disabled people don't make those reports. I think it's also because there is this fear, and this is reflected in disabled people's experiences, that when they do make complaints, they get left hanging, they get left without a resolution, they get left without being told that a particular driver has been spoken to or that any action will happen. So that feedback loop doesn't get closed. Therefore, disabled passengers who experience these discriminatory, practices, they feel, well, what is the point in me making this complaint when it isn't taken seriously?
The pressure always on the passenger, as per our Access Denied report as well. Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. I had a question about NR3S. I'm conscious of time, and a number of you have already spoken about the database, so please don't feel the need to repeat anything you've said to us previously. I invite views from the panel, and I think in reverse order to last time, so starting with Emma, then James, and then working way down the table in the room. Is there anything else that you wish to tell us about NR3S, how it can be improved, and then specifically we'd be interested in your views on the proposal of operators should have access to the register, and secondly whether there is merit in having a national database of all drivers. So a lot within that question, but if there are specific points that you wish to pick up on, please do let us know today or in writing, and starting with Emma.
Absolutely. So as I already mentioned, I won't go into too much detail, but more things need to be added to that database. So things like access refusals or reports of discriminatory behavior or making disabled passengers feel unsafe or uncomfortable. I'd like to see the register capturing that information as well.
It should be open to operators. Operators should also be included on that. So action against operators should be on the database. And, as I've said earlier, clear timescales for inputting information.
I agree with all previous points. Just to add that it's currently not clear how those searches are informing licensing decisions, and as our evidence shows, even if you look for an evidence of behavioural history, it's not necessarily leading to a safe decision about that driver's appointment.
Just push back. Nothing to add, just national database, yeah.
Okay, Alex.
Thanks. Probably specifically to Arooj, though others can join in. Why do you think it is that some licensing authorities decide to adopt lower standards than others?
I hate to say it, but my honest personal view is I think it becomes about money in instances because it's an income generator, and I think that's my honest view of it. I think that's why the standards are low. They push them out a lot quicker, and I would say the monetisation of it is probably the main issue, I think.
Do you ever think it could be kind of a legitimate strategy that you have slightly easier to achieve standards because you've got an undersupply of drivers and that might therefore sort of attract some in? Would that ever be a consideration?
I don't think we ever have an undersupply of drivers, but I think there's a moral case in just doing the right thing by traders and passengers, and I think setting them standards and having a cost associated with that standard. I think if you want to go into any profession, you'd want to be the best, so I think that is a win for the passenger and the driver themselves. But I think, you know, just implying and making sure that we've got them standards across the board is really important, and we should have consistency in that.
If I may, I think in some cases it's historic. When attempts are made to improve standards by authorities, there is great resistance from the vocal elements of their local trade. There is also the fear that they will lose what licensees they have to other authorities that have lower standards or lower fees. Yes, it is an income generator, but all taxi licence fees, hack and private hire licence fees, can only be applied to hackney carriage and private hire activity. Any surplus that is made cannot be creamed off for other local authority purposes. And that is another issue. We need more enforcement, quite clearly, in relation to disability and across the board. More enforcement is achievable, but the fees will go up. And local authorities need to appreciate that cost cutting across the board shouldn't apply to licensing. Licensing is one of the few areas of local government which is close to, not absolutely, but close to self-funding. So if authorities want more enforcement, if the trade want more enforcement, if the citizens want more enforcement, it is feasible, but the fees will go up.
Thank you. We've mentioned councillors and the councillor panels, the role of we've mentioned the councillors' panels. Now, I was a long-standing councillor, and in terms of town planning, in terms of entertainment and alcohol licences, the role of councillors on panels is to some extent restricted through different checks and balances. Is there an element that there should be a look at this process and the role of councillors in licensing? Arooj?
Absolutely, because at the moment it's guidance, so people can interpret that guidance according to their understanding of it, but if it's legislation, then you know you are bound by that. So that's the difference. So in planning, we know that we are just the legislative authority, planning authority. Licensing is different because it's guidance and not actual built-in.
The level of discretionary powers potentially exposes councillors to some of the pressures you've mentioned and those inconsistent decisions between different authority areas.
Whereas if it's baked in legislation, you cannot move from that.
Really important. Thank you, James.
Well, as I said earlier, our view is that these decisions should be taken by professional, trained, experienced licensing officers, not by councillors.
And
due to the inconsistencies of the decision making, there are very good councils with very good regulatory panels, but there are far too many examples of decisions being made that lead to licensing officers tearing their hair out because that person should simply not have been given a licence or allowed to retain a licence.
So they're having their recommendations overturned, basically, by councillors in those instances.
Well, that's even if the council allows a recommendation to be made, and in many cases they don't.
So, what are you suggesting? Taking councillors out of individual decision making and just overarching policy, and where would there be any role for them if there were common national standards?
Overarching policy, yes. There will still be a requirement for policy, even if there are national standards. That's the role of councillors. The role of the decision making, as I say, should be professional officers.
Arooj?
I would agree with that, and I think where there is a panel, I think most elected members do the right thing and respect officer recommendation. I think it's rare and unique, and I would be really alarmed, especially my own licensing authority, if I thought a member moved away from what an expert officer recommendation was. But I think this is why, if it's not guidance, if it's legislation, you can just make sure that assurance is there.
Is there a role for the Traffic Commissioner here?
If the role for the Traffic Commissioner, I would suggest, is that if this became a national licensing basis, but that's not what the Institute feels should be the case.
Fair enough. Okay. We have overrun somewhat, but it's been very, very useful for all of you because we've had quite broad perspective and perspective in this panel. So thank you very much for your responses and for your evidence, and appreciate the time you've taken from both panels. If there's anything you didn't get a chance to cover, do feel free to write to us. We'll continue to reflect on the evidence we've received. We've got a final evidence session with the Minister in the new year, and that concludes today's meeting. Order.